Great. Thank you very much. I don't know if I use this. Can you hear me like this when I use this microphone? Is it okay? Okay. So thank you very much for the introduction and the invitation and the opportunity to share a few sort of updates from the UNESCO perspective on education for sustainable development. It's been a very interesting morning. I don't speak Swedish, but I had a very good translator, so I was able to follow a little bit. And I think it's been a very interesting morning, and I hope I can add a little bit of interesting elements still before the lunch. So I think for around 20 minutes, I would like to say a little bit about the global policy environment that we see at the moment for education for sustainable development, then give you a little bit of updated information on what we as UNESCO do to promote ESD, then share a few considerations on where we see the future of ESD beyond the next couple of years going. And at the end, I have some very brief information of what is happening in terms of global monitoring with regard to the progress on ESD. As was said, I work for UNESCO in Paris, leading a team that is in charge of education for sustainable development. And as you know, UNESCO is among the United Nations agencies, the agency that is responsible for education for sustainable development. So here, just very briefly, as a reminder, sort of the current description of education for sustainable development with which we work. I will not read it out, but for a couple of important elements are that the focus is really on action. It's not only about sort of cognitive knowledge, it's really about ultimately action that is taken in favor of sustainable development and in order to transform society. It's an education that is conceived as very holistic in various ways. Holistic in the sense of how it sees sustainable development not only as individual topics such as climate change, but as an overall vision for a better world. To say it like that. Holistic also in the sense that it addresses not only what happens at schools, but really across the lifespan, education across the lifespan, and holistic also in the sense that it looks at it tries to foster the whole personality. So again, not only the cognitive dimension, but also the socio-emotional dimension and the behavioral dimension. With regard to the sort of what you could call the policy environment at the global level, I would like to make a few comments because I think at the moment it's with the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals, it's a very good moment for ESD, and it's a very good moment to continue to expand education for sustainable development further. And I think that is mostly due to two processes that have really been converging over the last couple of years, maybe over the last 15 years. And the first process is that within or among stakeholders and within processes that have supported sustainable development. So, for example, the climate change negotiation process, or the process leading from the Rio Conference in '92 to the Rio +20 conference in 2012, there has been an increasing emphasis on the role of education to promote sustainable development. Of course, there's a continued importance on political solutions, on technological solutions, but the emphasis that has been given to education has progressively become stronger. The discussions at the Rio +20 conference could be one example, but then also the Paris Agreement on climate change, where in Article 12 education is very well represented. And the second process basically is what has happened among education stakeholders at the global but also at national levels. And there we have also seen among education stakeholders an increasing emphasis on the importance of the issues of sustainable development, sometimes in the sense of inclusion of sustainable development related themes in curricula, sometimes more sustainable development as an overall vision for education, but certainly a process towards more giving more importance to sustainable development issues. The UN Decade on ESD that UNESCO has been leading is one example. The decade concluded with a big conference in Japan, in Aichi, Nagoya, as you know, and the outcome document is also, I think, a very strong document that makes clear that sustainable development has a crucial role within the education discourse to play. And then the adoption, basically, of the future education agenda at the global level, which then became Sustainable Development Goal 4 at the Incheon Conference in 2015. There we had also much more than in previous similar conferences an emphasis on sustainable development and education for sustainable development. And that all, at least if you agree with this kind of positive reading of it, concluded or culminated in the inclusion of education for sustainable development in the Sustainable Development Goals, specifically in Target 4.7, of course, but then also in Target 12.8 related to sustainable consumption, 13.3 related to climate change, but in fact really across all of the sustainable development goals. So that's, I think, that was just a few remarks to emphasize that I think really the global environment, when it comes to sort of the policy processes, it is of course another question what really happens then on the ground. But speaking about the policy environment at the global level, I think it's a very good dynamics that is at play for education for sustainable development. We've also realized it sort of within UNESCO, some very simple indicators. Sort of the team has grown, the funds that are dedicated to ESD have become larger, not as large as we would want to, but of course, but have become larger, and there's generally many more requests from member states for support that we get than we got maybe until, say, 10 years ago. Then, as you know, the current framework to implement the work at the global but also at the national levels is the Global Action Program launched at the World Conference at the end of 2014 with the 5 priority action areas that you know very well: policy, institutions, educators, youth, and local communities. At the global level, we try to generate action with the help of 95, it's at the moment 95, what we call key partners. That's particularly dedicated either member states or non-governmental organizations or networks working in education for sustainable development. And Swedest, the host today, of course, is among those partners. Then to mention a few examples on sort of recent activities that we have done at the global level to promote these five areas. In these activities around advocacy, policy dialogue, capacity building, information sharing, and resource development, just to give you sort of a few examples. So in terms of advocacy or promoting at the policy level education for sustainable development, we have regularly organized now for 3 years an entire education day during the climate change negotiation conference, first in Paris, then in Marrakesh, and then in Bonn. And that's also a new development, that we have an entire day dedicated really to education for sustainable development to increase the visibility of education among climate negotiators who otherwise maybe would not have so much connection to education or would not be so much aware of education as an important instrument to achieve their agenda. Then with regard to capacity building, we have capacity building activities, some in fact together with Swedest, building the capacities of teachers in Southern Africa is one of the key regions at the moment, and Central Asia. We have activities there, also thanks to Japanese extra budgetary funds that we have received. We organize capacity building workshops in all world regions for local government officials to sensitize them to how education for sustainable development can be promoted at the local level. Then we had a series of capacity building or training activities for young ESD leaders across the world. One sort of training activity in each world region, where we have tried to mobilize, build the capacity, sensitize around 500 young ESD leaders who now themselves go out and organize their own workshops for their own sort of peer group. And then we are organizing training workshops, in particular at the level of policymakers, and there we have at the moment 3 focus countries, Kenya, Vietnam and Costa Rica, who all have shown a very strong commitment to developing an ESD, national ESD strategy and then implementing it. With regard to sort of information sharing, the activities that we're doing is that we are facilitating the exchange between these 95 partners and between the 95 partners and the member states through regular meetings. And then every 2 years also we will organize now a big forum that brings together education for sustainable development stakeholders and stakeholders from global citizens who promote global citizenship education, which is more sort of the tradition of peace education. And that will happen from 2019 on every 2 years. And then in terms of resource development, also just to give you another example, we just recently published a guide that helps those responsible in environment ministries responsible for climate change to help them implement education into their national climate change mitigation plans. Produced also a training pack for schools on how to make schools climate resilient that we are at the moment rolling out through the UNESCO schools network. So just to give you a little bit of an update of the concrete activities we have been doing recently. We did a review of what these 95 partners have done in the first 2.5 years of the Global Action Program. All of these partners had set themselves targets at the beginning of the Global Action Program, and then we have asked them after 2 years, 2.5 years, how far have you advanced towards these targets? And the details here on the slide, and maybe you cannot even see it so well here, are not so important, but we developed 10 indicators around the Global Action Program and the activities of these key partners. And at the mid-term of the Global Action Program, most were well on track to reach the targets they had set themselves by 2019. And then here I just have very briefly two slides that show that these 95 partners, it's a limited group, of course. It's a very limited group, but we have tried to keep it deliberately from expanding much further in order to be able to work with them in a very strategic way and to be in close exchange with them basically continuously. And then these 95 partners have really managed to reach out globally to a large number of countries that you can see here listed. I mean, the details are not so important, but just to give you an impression that through this limited group of partners, we have been able to reach a large number of member states. Now, as a next kind of segment, I would like to briefly share a few ideas that we have been developing about the future of ESD. The Global Action Program framework at the moment, as you know, runs until 2019. When member states in the UNESCO General Conference will again take a decision on what the future strategy on ESD should be, what the future direction of ESD should be. And before member states consult, we have tried to anticipate a little bit the discussions in UNESCO, have organized a small series of ESD symposia among experts to do some brainstorming on the future direction of ESD. How does ESD have to be updated in light of new developments, of current challenges, maybe also in light of the learnings from the implementation of the Global Action Program, and also in particular responding to this overall new policy context that we now have, the Sustainable Development Goals as the overall framework for all our work at the UN. And there's this is still an ongoing process, but there's 5 sort of key issues that we have in this series of expert brainstorming symposia that we have sort of identified that should be strengthened in a future ESD approach, or where we should maybe revisit the approach that we have taken so far. The first one is sort of thinking about how, and looking also at some data on how young people or new generations see sustainable development. Very often it is not anymore among younger generations sort of an individual subject issue like climate change or consumption or water or poverty. Very often it relates really choosing to advocate for sustainable development relates very much to a kind of value choice that you take in your life. It's very much connected to sort of the question of how can I also lead a meaningful and fulfilling life. And one of the conclusions that I think we will have to draw is that we emphasize much more the promotion of sort of the values that are conducive to sustainable development in the future. Of course, we have in our discourse sort of always emphasized values, and ESD is about knowledge, skills, attitudes, and values. But it's something where we had the feeling that it should further be strengthened to do justice to this really holistic aspiration of education for sustainable development. The next issue sort of that we have come across and we are trying to work through is the issue of action at the community level. That the community is really, I mean, like ESD is really in the end is about concrete actions for sustainable development, and the locus of this action is sort of not the individual private person, but is the community. It can be the local community, but it can also be understood as a national community or as a even a global community. So we want to understand better and emphasize stronger the processes that lead to really joint community action for sustainable development. And that also means that the individual, talking about education, the individual needs to be equipped with the skills that are needed for meaningful community engagement. It means also, for example, that we teach and enable learning for sustainable development that makes it possible to engage politically in a meaningful way. Because in the end, if I as an individual learn to act and behave sustainably, that's all good, of course, and all positive, but the overall impact will be very small. I mean, when I just take my personal conclusions only, I think the real turnaround will only come when also action happens at the political level. So we have to also integrate that perspective very strongly and more than until now into education. Another point briefly is the issue of the various technological developments, especially in the area of kind of green technologies that are underway. And I mean, as you know, the developments have been so fast and so dramatic. The positive opportunities for promoting sustainable development through technologies, but also the challenges that come with that. From ESD we also need to respond to that in one way or another. So that's also something that we are working on when it comes to a kind of future direction of ESD. And then 2 more points. What I think also was has been a bit of a, not entirely, but partly a blind spot in education for sustainable development promotion is really sort of the direct relevance of education for sustainable development to people in extreme poverty. I think a lot of the education for sustainable development discourse, very much also from UNESCO's side, has been about issues of sustainable consumption, of how sort of steer industrialized societies towards greener societies, and I think we haven't paid enough attention to really what ESD can bring to someone really in a context of extreme poverty, and that's something that we want to emphasize more in the future, and to see how education for sustainable development can really start with sort of immediately improving livelihoods at the local level in a poverty context, and how education for sustainable development also can help in a context of extreme poverty support individual agency that makes people able to develop further beyond poverty. It's still, as you can see, it's still a bit kind of sketchy thoughts, but it's really an ongoing process at the moment that I wanted to share with you. And lastly, the issue of transformative pedagogy, which we have spoken about, of course, for a long time. But here also we feel the need to systematize our thinking and our messaging more, also taking into account new developments in psychology and in the neurosciences, and also maybe taking a step further even with regard to what kind of concrete implementation of ESD in the education sector we find helpful. If you really look at sort of what makes the pedagogical or the learning experience that very often makes people transform themselves and to act for sustainable development, it is very often not really what is happening in a school. It is much more something that is learned in the community through meeting someone who's active already for sustainable development. It is because you yourself, in one way or another, become engaged in a very concrete project, which I think has then very strong implications for how we see the role of schools and the formal education sector in education for sustainable development. And in all of this, of course, we want to conceptualize, and we are conceptualizing ESD as a key instrument to promote the sustainable development goals. And in a first step, we have spelled this out in this publication that maybe you have come across. We've launched it, I think, half a year ago around, or a bit more than half a year ago. And here we try to spell out the contribution that ESD can make to every individual of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals at the cognitive level, sort of the cognitive learning objective, the socio-emotional learning objectives, and then the behavioral learning objectives that you can download on our website. And that's sort of a kind of first attempt to conceptualize this new approach of education for sustainable ESD for the Sustainable Development Goals. And then in the last 2 minutes to just very briefly update you that one of our responsibilities as UNESCO is the monitoring of ESD. In the sense of very concretely monitoring the implementation of how countries are doing implementing Target 4.7, where ESD is in which ESD is contained. There's one adopted global indicator, which is looking not really so much at educational inputs, but not so much at educational outcomes, but really at what the education system provides for ESD, and the indicator is extent to which global citizenship, education, and education for sustainable development, including gender equality and human rights, are mainstreamed at all levels in policies, curricula, teacher education, and student assessment. And we have one specific data collection mechanism for that at UNESCO. It's a process that has been going on for years, actually, that we have now sort of reconceptualized to serve as a process to kind of collect data on the progress towards Target 4.7. It's a country reporting process concerning the recommendation on education for international understanding, where every 4 years countries report to us how they have advanced with regard to initially more here education for international understanding, but we have now updated to include also sustainable development goal issues, and we've just presented to the last UNESCO Executive Board in the autumn an update sort of the data, and we will soon have it on our website. And then we have also to complement this monitoring exercise, a couple of other sort of data collection and analysis mechanisms underway. And are dedicated, so I don't go through them in detail now. We have set up a dedicated website where you can find some kind of news and data analysis on the progress towards education for sustainable development. So a bit rushed at the end, but I wanted to at least share with you the information that we are very much engaged also, not only in the implementation and then in strategizing for the future, but also sort of tracking how countries are doing in ESD. With that, I conclude, and I hope I've managed to sort of share a few still interesting ideas before lunch. Thank you.
Thank you.